Oh, there we are.
Hello, we are live. We are live with LinkedIn and so excited today because Doug Rose and I are talking about LinkedIn learning and our courses, which are part of the, what is it, top 20 of the most watched courses on LinkedIn. So that is freaking fabulous. Can I say freaking fabulous? I think
I think so. Don't worry, it's not live.
I can.
So maybe we should put.
So
I should, you were number one. I mean, I think we should put that in there. They were 20. I'm in the 20, but you were number one. So we need to make
yes,
that
we will
distinction.
say my course is number one. Very
Yeah.
excited about that. It's so great to hear. And I have a little bit of pride, right, in being able to know that, oh, it was number one above some of the other courses that were out there. I know all year long I kept looking at Vernee Myers and Ariana Huffington, and I was like, oh, mine will never be more popular than theirs.
Wow. Well,
So very exciting to be able to have this conversation today because today we're talking about AI, artificial intelligence. And so before we dive in, I'll give you a little bit of background about me for those of you that have not seen or heard or know who I am. And then Doug will give us a background because he has a very interesting data science background, which is makes him smarter than me. So
well,
but I am Stacey Gordon. I'm the CEO of Rework Work. I'm an executive advisor and diversity strategist, and I spend time coaching and counseling executive leaders and talent acquisition teams, HR teams, and individual contributors in helping them to see the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion and being able to create workplaces where everyone belongs. So the number one course that I have is on unconscious bias. I also have a course on diversity recruiting. We'll put up some links for those later. But Doug, tell us about yourself.
yes, thank you, Stacey. I, mine won't sound as good, but I specialize in data science. I started out working sort of coaching organizations on how to embrace more agile mindset, which is a way to develop software products and digital products more effectively and efficiently. And then I sort of worked with a lot more products in data science, which is about working with teams specifically on delivering data products. So instead of software products, I've moved over to working with teams to help deliver data products. And then sort of in the last 10 years, that has almost entirely moved over to delivering products using artificial intelligence tools like machine learning and other things. And so on top of it, what I've been talking about most recently is data ethics. Kind of now that we have these tools in place, now that we're able to do some really interesting things with machine learning, AI, data science, what are some of our ethical obligations as working in organizations to make sure that these tools are used in a way that doesn't harm people? So, and that's kind of where what I've been working on most recently, and that's kind of where our work converges.
Awesome. Yeah. I've been doing a little bit of work in the like AI XR world, mostly around helping startups in that industry to be thinking about setting up their companies in a way where they are thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion from the beginning, rather than as most companies that have been around for a while, where they're kind of having to backtrack and do it. So actually, XR Inclusion is the organization that we have been putting out a lot of really great content through. We actually did a whole survey about that too. So whole other conversation. But today, I think the interesting thing is, so in preparation for this, Doug and I started talking about like, where does this pop up, right? Where do we see this? And I think it was really interesting when we start looking at where it shows up. It shows up in so many different places. It shows up in sales. It shows up in police departments. It shows up in education. So I don't know. I guess maybe give us a little bit, Doug. You were giving some really great examples about how this pops up for us.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that why there's a lot of organizational responsibility that goes into this, because and a lot of ethical discussions that have to happen kind of with just not at the highest levels of the organization, but really just with people who are doing the work. Because now you're creating these systems which are essentially transparent to customers and end users. And you're creating these systems to make decisions which are very difficult to trace back, looking at the algorithms that went into it. So if you're working with, if you have health insurance and they recommend one sort of avenue of treatment over another, they could be using a machine learning algorithm there, which is looking at your age, which is looking at your gender, which is looking at your income or your race or something like that to make healthcare decisions. And then they just let you know. And you don't necessarily sort of know all the little bits and pieces that went into that decision. And so because it happens, what machine learning people who work in data science teams and work with machine learning algorithms tend to refer to these as sort of black box decisions, because all of these algorithms work together in a way, and they're thinking in a way that's completely different from how human beings think. And they're making these decisions looking at patterns which are difficult for humans to even comprehend, and then they spit out an outcome. And so, someone could be go through one of these systems, and one person might be recommended for parole and the other person might not be. One person might get better health care and the other person might not. One person might get a loan, the other person might not. One person might get a credit card, the other person might not. And all of these decisions mix together these things in this black box, and it's unclear sort of how to detangle them to see how much bias there is impacting these decisions. And you don't really know until you look at it broadly.
So, I mean, you brought up some context that is really important to life, right? We talk about financial decisions, healthcare decisions, whether or not we're going to get parole, right? Like justice decisions. I'm going to go a little more, I guess, not as serious, right? Because I noticed this when I saw an article about TikTok. So, but I think it really is, it may seem like, oh, it's just entertainment, but I think it really captures the essence of what we're talking about, right? Because there's been so many, I started diving into all the different ways that AI, right, and the way that algorithms were affecting people disproportionately. So when I looked at this, what actually caught my attention was the strike. I don't know if not a lot of people are, I shouldn't say not a lot of people are on TikTok. A lot of people are on TikTok. Not a lot of people like me are on TikTok because I'm just not paying that much attention, right? A lot of entertainers and creators and younger people, if I'm going to be biased, right, are on TikTok. And what I think is really interesting, though, is that Black creators decided they were going to strike and not create new content for TikTok because they were very frustrated with the fact that they would create content and their content was not being shown as frequently on the platform. And then somebody else would come along, usually somebody white, would copy their content, and then their content would be shown widely, and they would gain all of these followers. And so they basically were benefiting off of these Black creators. And then you have to get to look at, well, it's the algorithm, right? So it's like, is that what we're talking about when we talk about this AI and how this is working?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think we talked about, I call this the Elvis Presley effect, kind of, yeah. That there are, and the thing is that it's not, and this sort of ties into your book a little bit, is that it's not necessarily, I have your book here, I'm just going to do a quick there. So, but this ties into your book a little bit about how this is not necessarily, 3 or 4 people sitting in a room kind of figuring out how to change these rankings. What this is that their data, they're crunching their data in a way where they're making decisions about who gets promoted and demoted in the timeline. And those decisions, all these algorithms that go into making these decisions, some of them might be quite biased, because they're looking at the data, and they might be looking at the data earnestly. It might be what sort of data scientists call well calibrated. So it might be correctly sort of promoting things or demoting things based on how many people they think will click it, but the outcome in the end is quite biased. And so how do you correct for that? Is it sort of benefiting some to the detriment of others? And is that in the data, or is it well calibrated? Does that mean that, like, that people are more likely to see some people or want to see some people over others? Or is it poorly calibrated, where it's just it's not looking at the data correctly? And if it's well calibrated, then how do you change the data to make it more fair?
Well, and even I think what you said is, like, if they're looking at what do people find interesting, right? Who gets
Yeah.
to decide, right, what people would find interesting, and then create that algorithm based off of it. So interestingly enough, I was thinking of going back and looking at, like, oh, what has TikTok done in the past? But just a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal, I guess it's been such a big thing that they decided, we want to go figure out TikTok's algorithm. So they officially, TikTok says, right, that they use 4 signals: what you watch, what you share, what you like, and what you follow. And that is what they use. That's the analysis. But what Wall Street Journal said is, like, really what seems to be the most important is how long you linger over a piece of content. And what is really detrimental about that is, if I am, and I think the article used an example, if I'm a person that is not, I'm depressed, right? I have a mental health challenge right now, and I'm watching these videos about people who are also depressed, it's going to keep giving me more of that, and which is going to keep me in a depressive state, right? So there's also just mental health challenges with this too. There's that, I think, not just from a bias standpoint, I think and the reason I'm sticking with TikTok with this, because there was just so much information. It was like, wow, you guys really screwed this up. If you look, there's like 3 different apologies over the last year, right? That TikTok is like, oh, we're so sorry, we stand with Black people. Oh, we're so sorry, we stand with the LGBTQ people. Oh, we're so sorry. And it's like, really? When are you going to stop being sorry and fix it, right?
And that's one of the big challenges, is that, and usually when, is that they might not know how to fix it yet, because a lot of these decisions are happening sort of in a black box. And so they have to sort of deconstruct a huge amount of data and analysis to figure it out. And so a lot of times people don't figure out that these outcomes are biased until they start looking at until they start looking at them broadly. And so my guess is that, the system wasn't designed to do this. But what happened is that it had an unfair outcome. And so now there's some meetings in TikTok where they're like, oh man, we've got to figure out how to fix this thing. And the problem is that these systems are becoming so complex, and the machines are crunching the data in a way that humans can't comprehend, that it takes a long time to figure out where the biased data started to throw off the whole system. So, and on top of it, and this is what they talk about in terms of well calibrated and poorly calibrated, is TikTok, like a lot of social media platforms, rewards engagement. And so, if you're ever, I live here in Atlanta, and Atlanta sort of it's almost got sort of a global reputation for having terrible drivers. And so there's always an accident on 85 when I drive down. And everybody slows down, even if it's not sort of cutting off traffic, to look at the accident, because people they're engaged with it. They're watching the accident. They want to see if someone's hurt. They want to see if someone's okay. They want to see what car it was and things like that. Now, they may pass by hundreds of billboards each day and not look once, but for the accident, they'll slow down and watch. And social media platforms reward that type of behavior. And that's why you said, when you look at social media, if you say you're depressed, it will hit you with 6 or 7 different videos about it, because the algorithm rewards engagement. And so if you stare at it for a long time, then it's going to show you more of it. And it's going to show people who are in your affinity group, people who it thinks that are like you, the same stuff. So does that make sense?
It does. And so we're basically creating these bubbles, and these, and that's also when we look at the politics, right, of the last few years, where we're creating these echo chambers, and where I say X is true. And so everyone else who says it, now we're all in the same group. So now we just keep perpetuating the same cycle of information, and we're not able to even see, we don't even get shown anything outside of what is directly in front of us. So then, of course, our reality is that X is true, because everything we see tells us that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that exist outside of that. We just can't see them. And that helps to create such a, I don't even know what the word is for that, but it's really, it's taking, I think, our society in a direction that I don't think any of us ever imagined it would go in.
Yeah, the term I hear some data scientists use is infospace. Is kind of, I live in my own little infospace where I get information from, certain algorithms and certain things that reinforce, and so I can essentially live in that info, and you can live in your infospace, and I can live in my infospace, and we might live right next door to each other, and be interacting with the world and sort of with two different realities. It's like we each have our own matrix,
Right.
And so,
right. That's very true.
And so
there's a
challenge.
That's very true. So there's a comment here. It says, I'm finding that AI just plain sucks. I watched Forged in Fire on Netflix, and then Netflix loads my suggestion list with reality elimination shows, which I typically do not like. The algorithm has no clue why I liked Forged in Fire. So that's an interesting point as well, right? Is that you might watch one show because there's something in there that was interesting to you, and now you can't get away from it. They're just going to keep recommending these things because you had engagement in this one type of content.
Yeah, and Netflix actually got into a little bit of trouble, I think, pretty recently, because their thumbnails that they show you for each movie or video or whatever changes based on who it thinks you are. So my son is, like, I guess a lot of 14-year-olds, pretty indoctrinated in the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so he's been wanting to watch, we've been watching the last, 2 weeks or so, Luke Cage, which is on Netflix. I'm not plugging it. It's a great show. And there was an article that showed that if you're African-American and you're a Netflix consumer, it will show you a picture of Luke Cage, who's an African-American man, if you're not a comic book fan. But if you're not, it will show you a picture of another character who's not African-American. And so, because it just sort of, it assumes certain things about you, and it shows you a thumbnail based on, who it thinks you are.
Right.
And someone posted a really interesting picture of their Netflix feed, and it was all really sort of hypersexualized. All the pictures were like, even comic book characters were in bikinis and things like that. And it was because they watched something like, I don't know, there's a Netflix show called From Down Below or something, where some woman has a fairly tawdry affair with a merman. And so all of their, and I didn't even know what a merman was until I read that article, but apparently, yeah, that's a thing. And so it changed all of their stuff to have pictures of people in bikinis and things.
Right. Yeah. So it's very, I think, so for company leaders that are listening, right, and thinking about, wow, technology, right? Everyone wants to go, because I think for removing bias, that's one of the things I hear is, well, I think it was Amazon we talked about, right, that did this. We'll just use an algorithm to, if we use computers, right, then that will take bias out of it, and then we won't have bias anymore in our workplace. But we have found that is not the case, because guess who has to program the algorithm, right? People with bias. And so you end up programming in your own bias, and then the computers are really good at honing that in and exacerbating it.
Yeah. The computers will tell you the truth, and you just might not like seeing it. And so that was the problem with Amazon, is that Amazon, they created an Amazon algorithm that said, look at the people who are getting promoted in our organization and who are doing well in our organization, and then find resumes of people out in the internets of people who match the people who are doing well in our organization. And when they did that, it turned out that most of the people who are doing well in their organization were not women. And so the algorithm saw that, and this is an instance of where the algorithm was well calibrated. It saw this. It said, okay, well, if you want to do well in Amazon, you have to not be a woman. And so then it's looked through all these resumes, and it sort of took all the women out, and it said, well, here you go. Here's people who are going to do well here. And so, Amazon sort of had to look at who it's promoting, and it shined a light on how things were going in its organization. And then they didn't use the system because it had, obviously that's a pretty big problem. But it showed them it was well calibrated. So it showed them what was going on with the data. And now what they have to do is they have to figure out, that's kind of more in your territory. They have to figure out how to make the organization more fair,
Right.
and have to.
And I do think that some of that comes from, we need to have less of a reliance, I think, on technology for some of these things, because technology can't see nuance, right? Technology doesn't see shades of gray. So another example, and I'm going back to TikTok for a second, is there was a TikTok user who had actually gone viral for showing that every time that he tried to use the word Black, he was getting told that his content was inappropriate. And he was like, what in the hell is going on here, right? So this was huge, because he was like, I can type in white supremacy and that's okay. But for some reason, Black Lives Matter is a problem.
Yeah.
One of the things they said was, well, it had something to do with the fact that he typed in the word Black and audience. And in audience, the word die is in there, right? If you spell audience, DIE is in there. And so it put those two things together. And so that was why it was, I think there's other things at play, but even if you go with that, a person looking at it would be able to see, well, that's stupid. We don't need to block this. A computer is not going to be able to make that judgment. And so I think that we have to look at these places where we are trying to switch out people for computers and maybe dial that back. So the answer might be, we don't need technology to be the screeners for applications when we're trying to hire people.
Yeah, I mean, it's or if you do use machines, make sure that the machines are working in a way that are better than, because I take a slightly different view about this. I think the machines can, in many ways, if you if you work with them and if you look at the data objectively, can in some ways actually be more fair than a lot of people. I mean, if you can create the machines so that they are, when they look at job applicants, they don't look at gender and things like that, then they can pump out stuff that is inherently fair. But if you are kind of not, it's kind of a strange concept, but if the machine works too well, then what it will do is it will amplify the bias in your organization, and it will do an incredibly good job of making that problem much worse. And
right.
So you could create a system that would be more fair. You just have to be aware of the inherent unfairness if you just use the data as is.
So maybe we're not ready for that yet, because we are not a society that has figured this out. Because I think the piece that you said is, we can create it if it's subjective. Am I objective? Are you objective? Right? Like, let's be real, we're not. So it would take a lot, I think, and I'm not saying it can't be done, but then you have to be very, very intentional. And I think that's the answer, right? Is that it's going to have to go through so many different layers of review and scrubbing to make sure that we can get it to a place where it would be at least as objective as humans can make it, right?
Yeah, people have to develop expertise in it. I mean, you need to work with more people who know what you know. You have to develop people who have expertise, who can look at the systems, and it's kind of, I know, because I've read your book and I've enjoyed it. And it's on hardcover on Amazon. And it's but the way that you work is that you work with people, which is great, and people in organizations. And well, that was well done.
There you go.
Uh, and and I think that if you had more people with your expertise that could move into the data science side, so that you could have this kind of analysis with systems, then you could make systems that are designed to work as fairly as possible. Because the danger with the systems is that people think that since it's math and statistics and things like that, that it's just going to pump out something that's fair. But they don't realize that the data that it's crunching is inherently unfair. And so there has to be someone who's an expert in that area, who can look at the data and be like, okay, this is the problems that we're going to get from this.
So we need some cross-functional teams.
Yeah, I mean, we need more people who understand, like the stuff you do, working with the people who I work with.
Right, right.
Not just.
I think that would be a very, I think of myself. I was trying to crunch some data for a survey that I put out the other day, and it took me some time. I was like, I don't have the brain power for this.
Yeah.
And so I think it really is having those cross-functional conversations, and it's going to have to be a lot of back and forth, a lot of testing. So I think for those who have systems in place right now and are relying on AI, I think we're both saying you need to take a really hard look at those systems and look at the output, because many times you will look at the output and say, oh yeah, of course it's fair, because you agree with the output. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's fair, because you're not objective.
Yeah, or the output might reflect your organization, and that's bad. I mean, that was kind of what happened with, that's what happened with I think we talked about the parole recommendation systems.
Yeah.
Is that they go through Florida and they look at how juries react to different people who commit different crimes, and then they pump all of that into a data repository or data lake, and then you start to crunch the system, to crunch the numbers. Now, what they found is that people in Florida are much less likely to sort of grant parole to African Americans, or specifically African American men. And so they didn't think about that before they put that into the system. And so when they started to, when it started to sort of produce recommendations, it ended up being quite biased. But it was reflecting its experience with jurors in Florida, or with judges in Florida as well. But it was, but that's a bad outcome, is that if you're going to use a system like that, then you have to be more fair than a typical jury system in Florida, a set of jurors in Florida, because you're amplifying their decision making to affect thousands or tens of thousands or millions of people. So what would be sort of a tragedy for one person in whatever Orlando, Florida, suddenly turns out to be sort of a systemic bias for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people who interact with this system.
Right.
And so you have to have, like I said, more people like you in there who are looking at the data and just being like, okay, well, do we really want to take the raw data from jury decisions, judges' decisions in Florida, and then amplify it to be the entirety of our system? Or should we work with the data in a way to make it a little bit more fair?
Yes, yes. So I think that hopefully this conversation has brought some awareness, right, to individuals. I would hope that if company leaders have AI systems in what am I trying to say here? At work, right, in their workplace, or implemented in their workplace, that they've been thinking about these things and having these conversations. And if not, then we say, please, please start it. Yeah. This is the time to be thinking about it. These are the kinds of things when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and company leaders say, what do we do? here's one thing you do. Go take a look at your technology systems and see, are they functioning correctly, right? That's something we can do. So that would be my takeaway. I don't know, Doug, if you have any.
No, it's basically the same thing. Don't create systems that harm large groups of people. That's just to have have people in place um, who uh, who understand uh, who understand how to work with organizations the way you understand it, and then take that expertise, and instead of having them working with individuals and organizations, have them work with data and data scientists and systems, so that you're not creating these massive systems that are creating unfair outcomes, and you don't realize it until you've victimized a huge chunk of people.
Right.
Because that's how we're figuring it out now. We're just like, I'm sure, at some point they're going to figure out what went wrong with TikTok, and it'll be a teachable moment for everybody, but
It'll be a case study.
exactly. But it's already going to be, it's already going to make a whole bunch of potential creators in TikTok not successful. And so you have
Right.
to be careful not to create systems that do that to people.
Love it. I see Nancy Ann Key says that she attests that this conversation has definitely brought awareness to her. So that's awesome. And then, Doug, do you have a course? It doesn't have to be your top course, because I know you have tons of courses, that would be one that they should be looking for, that maybe will help guide them, give them some thoughts around this process?
Yeah. Oh, wow. Thanks. It's I'm finishing up a book on data ethics, and I have 3 courses in the LinkedIn library on this topic in data ethics. And that is me talking about, because that's the problem with these issues, is that it's not like project management or something like that, although I'm a big Bonnie fan. But it's it's about, you can't sort of use a set of skills to deal with each one of these problems. It's fundamentally a moral issue. And so in that course, I try to show you how to think about these things in a way that's consistent with sort of ethical, moral philosophy, and sort of how to look at them in a way so that you can have these discussions in your organization without, everybody screaming at each other.
Gotcha. Awesome. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to LinkedIn Learning. I'm going to put up this little ticker, which we laugh about. LinkedIn.com/learning is where you'll find all of the LinkedIn courses. Doug Rose doesn't have his last name up, but if you look for Doug Rose, you will find his courses. And I suggest taking a look, right? Diving into a couple of those and seeing if this can help you to start thinking a little bit differently about the content that is being put out there. And so we really appreciate having this conversation, because this is the first time I've really sat and had a deep conversation about this issue, even though I've been seeing it in a lot of places. And so I do think hopefully this will be, a conversation that we can continue. There can be more conversations like this, because I do think that there is a lack of awareness about how this impacts people. And what's really bad about it is it impacts people in large quantities, right? It's not something that it's just like, it's going to impact 1 or 2 people. Like, we're impacting hundreds, thousands, and in some cases, millions, depending upon what the system is. So there is really, like you said, an ethical responsibility to ensure that before you roll out these systems, and not only before, but after you've rolled it out, to constantly keep checking, right? To keep iterating, to keep reviewing and testing and seeing what the impact is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And by the time you've noticed that something's gone wrong, it's pretty bad at that point. Is that there's these algorithms are making decisions about you all the time, and it's so transparent that most of the ones, you wouldn't even notice. It's just, you just don't know. It's like my wife is a huge fan of being a Delta frequent flyer, and they always, they let some people in the first class and they don't let other people in the first class, and no one knows how they come up with that. It's just an algorithm in a black box somewhere, and that
That
happens
is so
with
funny that you
everything.
mentioned that.
Yeah,
Somebody just was talking about that the other day. I don't know, I can't remember who I was talking to about being on Delta. And they're like, every time, and she was like, I've got tons and tons and tons of miles. And every time I show up on the upgrade list, and she's like, I'm always like 26 of 26.
I know. And I don't, yeah. And whenever I sometimes, we'll go to visit my dad in Florida, who's sort of 78-year-old and never flies Delta Gold only because of credit card. And he's upgraded every time. And we don't, and Yelena's like platinum and she's never up. So there's these algorithms make decisions about us all the time. And these are just ones that are sort of apparent. I mean, anytime you call and you're trying to sort of get more credit on your credit card, or you're trying to sort of, negotiate a better deal with your cell phone or whatever, or I mean, all these decisions are being made, and you don't usually notice it until it's so obviously wrong.
Right. Wow. Well, on that note, we are going to say thank you all for joining us. We appreciate that you connected and posted questions, and the links will be up so you can watch again later if you'd like. Thank you, Doug, for connecting with me and having such an interesting conversation. I know for some people, they probably thought data science, I don't know, but it's like me when I talk about bias, like, really? But these are great conversations to have,
That's a
very
big
interesting. I think it's so important. So I really appreciate being able to connect with a fellow LinkedIn instructor.
Yeah, me too, Stacey. You're the best. And so,
Awesome.
and I don't know, I just want to say one more time, #1 course on LinkedIn. Just get that out there.
Thank you.
#1.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Well, I'll also just throw up here and right. This is my book, so you can buy it. It's on Amazon. It's on all the places, Barnes and Nobles, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you so much. And I'm going to end the broadcast.